Hi there, it's Llarold, and we're back with a Protection Warrior guide for patch 8.1. I'll start out this video by covering what's changing for the class, and then move on to how to play, spec, and gear. If you are looking for a little more detail on Protection Warrior or Brewmaster Monk, you can check out Wowhead's class guides for either of those two specs, both of which I have indeed written. Starting with changes, Warriors are the one tank receiving a significant batch of changes in this patch, and they're the tank that probably needs the biggest amount of changes, so I'll preface all of this by saying that while there is some mix of good and bad, it's heavily in favor of good. My optimistic expectation is that Warriors will go from being the bottom of the totem pole in terms of representation and community opinion to at least making their way up into the middle of the pack. First off is a great change. Ignore Pain is being taken back off of the global cooldown. It's such an obvious change, it's almost like some players said it was a bad idea that would be extremely inconvenient to use.
It's on the global cooldown, so holy crap is it inconvenient to use.
Yeah. Taking Ignore Pain off the GCD means it will no longer interfere with your ability priority, and that's definitely a good thing. One of the biggest frustrations of Warrior tanking so far this expansion is that there are a lot of times during combat where the right way to play is to cap out on rage, just wasting it, because spending a global on Ignore Pain would be less useful than spending it on a free revenge cast or thunderclap. That issue will be gone. Unfortunately, Ignore Pain still has its fixed cost of 40 rage, and it really isn't all that strong. It also still caps out at 130% of its base value, so you won't be spamming out Ignore Pains, and if you already were playing with a defensively minded approach, you probably won't notice much more of a defensive increase. What you will notice is an offensive increase, and that's still good. Protection Warriors, for all of their shortcomings in this expansion, are the #1 tank at dealing damage, and this change will make them slightly better at that. Intercept is also being taken off of the global cooldown. There's not really much to say about this change. Intercept being on the global cooldown has been really inconvenient. I'm glad to see it put back. The end. Let's move on. Shield Block's base cooldown is being reduced by 2 seconds. In practice, with about 35% haste, this should result in a 1.3 second reduction in the real cooldown, worth about 11% more active uptime. That's a very good buff at reducing blockable damage, and Warriors should become even better at blocking damage, which is the thing they already do best. What about unblockable damage, though? Vanguard is being buffed again. It's gaining another 5% to stamina, and 10% to the strength to armor conversion rate. There was a similar hotfix buff earlier on in the expansion, and it was worth about 5% effective health against physical attacks. Due to diminishing returns, this buff isn't quite as impressive as the previous hotfix was, but it is also a larger number, so it's still helpful. Everything counts. Reinforced Plating, a mediocre Azerite trait, is being replaced with Bastion of Might. This applies to gear retroactively as well, so look out for that if you have any pieces that have Reinforced Plating on them. Bastion of Might looks like a mediocre trait, unfortunately, and really not all that much of an upgrade over Reinforced Plating. Deafening Crash is being nerfed significantly, limited to only 6 seconds of added demoralizing shout duration. While I hate this change in the moment, it probably is the right move by Blizzard. There is a real potential for Protection Warriors that they could start moving toward 100% uptime on Demoralizing Shout if the hard cap of 6 extra seconds wasn't added. So I get it. This trait is still worth about 20% extra uptime on Demoralizing Shout, which is a really big deal. It's definitely still the #1 trait, no question. Finally, the all-purpose Tier 3 Azerite trait, Azerite Fortification, is being removed. And in the case of Warriors, it's being replaced with Intimidating Presence, which slows enemies when you hit them with Intimidating Shout, and shields a bit of their damage once the fear breaks. This trait is weird. I guess there's a potential that you can use Untalented Intimidating Shout as an AoE CC with this trait, but it just seems risky, and like you have to pass up some nice defensive traits to get it anyways. I'm gonna say, this isn't a big deal. Now that we've covered the changes, let's move on to how to play the class. Ignore Pain going off the GCD makes everything simpler, and puts the emphasis for skillful play on rage management. In single target, you want to hit your enemy with Shield Slam and Thunderclap as much as you can. In AoE, you want to hit everything with Thunderclap and Revenge as much as you can. You'll also want to keep Avatar and Demoralizing Shout active as much as possible in every situation to maximize your damage output and damage reduction. Always try to maintain shield block whenever you're actively tanking. It is your first, strongest line of defense against most sources of damage. As for when and how to use Ignore Pain, that hasn't really changed, it's just easier to do now. If you need damage reduction, spend your rage on Ignore Pain. It's that simple. If you really don't need damage reduction, spend your rage on revenge. Always try to cast Ignore Pain before you get hit by predictable sources of unblockable damage, like boss abilities. Although they aren't rotational skills, Shockwave and Stormbolt, if you talent into Stormbolt, are really great stuns that are worth mentioning, because they can shut down enemies who are trying to cast or run away. And finally, while I usually don't talk all that much about how to use defensive cooldowns in these videos, making liberal use of your defensive cooldowns is usually the difference between a skilled cool guy warrior who lives through scary stuff and a dead warrior who lets the group down and feels bad and is bad. Last Stand has become an insanely powerful defensive cooldown this expansion, thanks to Bolster, and you should look to use it whenever you really need an extra jolt of survival, especially if you don't have shield block active or available. Finally, be on the lookout for places to use Spell Reflection. Spell Reflection has been really well supported in BFA's encounter design thus far. There are Mythic Dungeon bosses you can hit for hundreds of thousands of damage with a well-timed Reflect, and it can prevent debuffs from being applied by Vectis and Gahoon in Uldir. Now let's quickly go over talents. Here's a one-size-fits-almost-all talent setup. In the second tier, Crackling Thunder is great for making sure your Thunderclap hits everything in AoE, but if you're taking single target or you really need the extra mobility, Bounding Stride is a great alternative. Down in the fifth tier, I prefer Stormbolt because it provides a second stun option and it works out to 20 yards, but Rumbling Earth is not a bad talent if you're just trying to keep things simple. The biggest talent options in terms of having real gameplay repercussions are Vengeance and Devastator in tier 6. Devastator is not popular, and it doesn't really compete with Booming Voice and AoE, but it can be a fairly competitive option in single target. As for Vengeance, it's been a terrible talent thus far in BFA because of Ignore Pain being on the global cooldown. Now that Ignore Pain isn't on the global cooldown, Vengeance may make a resurgence. Maybe. Now let's move on to gearing. Here's the stat priority. Mastery and versatility have both been really good number 2 options so far in the expansion and about even in value, but with Ignore Pain going off the global cooldown, versatility is probably going to jump up ahead of Mastery a little bit. One special note for when you're running Mythic Dungeons, Ataldazar is far and away the best dungeon to farm if you're trying to gear up. Here's a list of pieces with haste that drop from Ataldazar. Weapon, Shield, Cloak, Gloves, Pants, Ring, Best in Slot Trinket. It's also the easiest dungeon in BFA? Or maybe I just think that because I've run it a few hundred times more than everything else. Now let's move on from gear to more gear. Azerite traits. Even with the nerf, Deafening Crash is a great one-point wonder. It's an excellent offensive and defensive option, and you shouldn't think twice about taking it. Brace for Impact and Iron Fortress are both very decent defensive options. If you're looking to maximize your damage output, aim for damage proc traits. This is true in tier 2 as well, where Gut Ripper and Heed My Call are excellent damage choices. If you are looking for a good defensive option in tier 2, Azerite Veins gets the job done very nicely. And finally in tier 3, Gemhide is good, but not quite as good as it is for most other tanks. Warriors have so much base armor already that the armor Gemhide provides is pretty heavily diminished. The steady trickle of healing granted by Impassive Visage is a much better option if you have it available. Well, I think that about covers it. If you have any questions about Protection Warrior, ask away. With patch 8.1 imminent, and Battle for Dazara lore and Mythic Dungeon Season 2 coming in January, we have some cool ideas for videos to do, but if you have any ideas, we'd love to hear them. Stay tuned for more patch 8.1 content, and as always, please like and subscribe. Thanks for watching. Bye.